Welcome to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. I'm Nik Michael. There are moments in life that don't look like moments. No announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no visible threshold that anyone else in the room would recognize as significant. Just a feeling, a pause after a conversation ends, a shift in someone's tone, a message that reads shorter than usual, a look that crosses someone's face for only a second. And your mind is already working to decide what it means about you. And within seconds, something begins to happen internally that most people never stop to examine. Your thoughts speed up. Your body tightens. You start reviewing what you said, how you said it, what you should have said differently. Not because you know you did something wrong, but because something feels off. And your nervous system has already quietly handed you the bill. That moment, that internal shift that nobody else sees is a pivot point. And if you miss it, nothing changes. If you catch it, something can. I've been a therapist in practice for over 30 years. I work with people every day, adolescents, adults, families, and I have sat across from some of the most self-aware, emotionally intelligent, genuinely well-intentioned people you will ever meet. People who work hard, who care deeply, who try to do right by the people around them. And some of the most exhausting psychological patterns I see in a clinical office, in a school setting, and honestly, in life, don't come from people who are careless. They come from people who care too much in a direction that isn't actually accurate. Today, we're talking about diffused guilt. Not guilt in the clean, specific sense that serves a purpose, but the blurry, ambient kind that spreads itself across situations where it doesn't belong, the kind that makes you feel responsible for things you didn't cause, emotions you didn't create, and tension that was never yours to carry in the first place. This pattern shows up across every season of life. It shows up in your 20s, when you're still trying to figure it out, who you are, and approval still feels like a prerequisite for safety. It shows up in your 30s and 40s when you're carrying work responsibilities, relationship expectations, maybe a family, maybe aging parents, and the pressure to hold it all together without complaint. It shows up later in life when you're the steady one, the caregiver, the anchor, the person everyone leans on, and you've spent so many years managing other people's emotional states that you've stopped noticing how much of it was never actually yours. I've seen it in students sitting across from me at school who apologize before they've even finished a sentence. I've seen it in adults in practice who have spent decades quietly shrinking themselves to keep the peace. And I've seen it in myself in the moments where I felt the pull to over-explain, over-accommodate, or fix something that I had no real part in breaking. Different stages of life, different settings, same pattern. And the cost is quiet but significant, because when guilt becomes diffused, responsibility becomes distorted. And when responsibility becomes distorted, people stop making choices based on what is actually right and start making choices based on how to prevent the next uncomfortable moment. That's where the pivot point begins. What is diffused guilt? Diffused guilt doesn't arrive as a thought. It arrives as a signal. You don't sit down and think, I am now experiencing diffused guilt. You feel something first, a tightness in the chest after saying no to someone, a pit in the stomach when someone seems disappointed, an almost magnetic pull to follow up a perfectly reasonable statement with an apology, a loop in the mind trying to locate the error before anyone else points it out. And then the story forms around the signal. Maybe I upset them. Maybe I handled that wrong. Maybe I came across too direct. Maybe I should send another message and smooth this over. Now here's where Gestalt therapy gives us something important. One of the foundational ideas in Gestalt work, and something I trained deeply in with Irv and Miriam Polster, is the concept of awareness. The idea that clarity doesn't come from figuring out the right answer intellectually. It comes from learning to notice what is actually happening in you right now. Most people, when that guilt feeling shows up, don't pause to examine it. They react to it. They obey it. They let it make decisions. The pivot point begins with noticing the signal before obeying it. There's a meaningful distinction worth making here because people often collapse these two things into one. Healthy guilt is specific. It says, I did something that violated my values. I caused harm I need to address. I was dishonest, unkind, or careless in a way that matters. That kind of guilt is useful. It protects relationships. It holds people accountable. It points toward something real. Diffused guilt is different. Diffused guilt says, something feels uncomfortable. Therefore, it must be me. There is no specific violation. There is no clear evidence. There is only an emotional atmosphere that the mind has already started translating into self-blame. One is connected to evidence. The other is connected to sensation. And when people confuse the two, they spend enormous amounts of energy repairing things that were never actually broken, at least not by them. I want to make this concrete because diffused guilt doesn't have a single face. It wears many. If you're a student or early in your career, it might look like this. Your supervisor sends a short email. No warmth, no context, just direct. And your nervous system activates before you've even finished reading it. You're already scanning backward through the week, trying to locate the mistake you haven't even been told you made. You spend the next hour distracted, anxious, preparing a defense for a conversation that may never happen. If you're in a relationship, diffused guilt shows up in silence. The person you care about pulls back slightly. They're quieter, a little less responsive. And instead of letting that be what it is, maybe they're tired. Maybe they're distracted. Maybe they just had a hard day. Your mind turns inward immediately. What did I do? What did I miss? How do I fix this? If you're a parent, it can take on a different weight entirely. Your child is struggling. They're upset, acting out, pulling away from you. And instead of holding space for their experience as something separate from yours, you absorb it. If they're not okay, something I did caused it. That's not parenting. That's over-responsibility dressed up as love. And if you're a caregiver caring for an aging parent, holding a family together through illness or transition, diffused guilt goes even deeper. Because the losses are real. The grief is real. The responsibility is real. But somewhere in all of that reality, a particular kind of guilt attaches itself that says, if I had done more, been there more, given more, this wouldn't be as hard. That is one of the most painful expressions of diffused guilt I encounter. And it deserves to be named clearly because it is not the truth. Different lives, different contexts, the same quiet internal mechanism taking credit for things it did not cause. Let me walk you through a specific moment because this is where the pivot point lives. Imagine you finally say something healthy, something clear and direct that you've been avoiding for weeks. You tell your manager, I can't take on another project this week. My capacity is full. A completely reasonable statement, a healthy one. And for a moment, you feel okay about it. Then your manager pauses for 2 seconds and says, okay, just that. Okay. And within minutes, your nervous system is activated. You're replaying your tone. You're analyzing the 2-second pause. You're wondering whether you came across as a team player or a problem. You're drafting a mental follow-up that softens what you said. You're considering whether to just offer to take the project away to make the discomfort go away. Now, watch this moment carefully because the pivot point is not the boundary itself. The pivot point is the moment immediately after the disconnect appears. Most people move quickly to eliminate that discomfort. They retract. They over-explain. They volunteer anyway. They collapse the boundary and call it being flexible. Not because the boundary was wrong, because the sensation of possible disapproval felt threatening. But awareness creates space, And that space changes what comes next. Instead of reacting automatically, you pause long enough to ask a different question. Not how do I make this better, but what is actually mine here? Did I communicate respectfully? Yes. Did I state something true about my capacity? Yes. Did I violate my values or cause harm to anyone? No. Then the remaining discomfort, the awkwardness, the uncertainty, the 2-second pause may simply belong to the situation itself or to the other person's response, not to your wrongdoing. And that distinction changes everything. The relational pattern I see in therapy, I see this all the time. And I want to be direct about it. Many people who develop diffused guilt learned something early. They learned that other people's emotions are indicators of their performance. They learned that when someone is unhappy, it means something about them. They learned that approval created safety and disapproval was something to be managed and prevented. That learning was often adaptive. In certain families, in certain environments, being attuned to everyone else's emotional state kept things stable, kept things safer, kept the peace. But what was adaptive at 12 years old becomes limiting at 35. Because now you're making decisions not based on what is right or healthy or aligned with your values, but based on what will minimize the emotional friction around you. That's not freedom. That's emotional threat management. And it's exhausting because carrying the emotional states of everyone around you is psychologically expensive. It costs you attention. It costs you clarity. It costs you the ability to accurately assess situations because your nervous system has already submitted the verdict before the evidence is even in. One of the most significant shifts a person can make, and I have watched people make this shift in clinical work over months and years, is arriving at this understanding. Someone else's discomfort does not automatically mean I did something wrong. That sounds simple. It is not easy. Because when someone you care about is uncomfortable and your nervous system has been trained to treat that as information about your performance, pausing long enough to question that wiring takes real effort, real awareness, real practice. But it is possible, and when it begins to happen, the change is not subtle. So what does the pivot actually look like in practice? It looks small. It almost looks small. You feel the urge to over-apologize, a reasonable statement, and you don't. You feel the pull to over-explain yourself after one clear sentence, and you stop. You feel someone's disappointment in the room, and you allow it to exist without rushing to erase it. You feel that familiar loop starting. Did I do something wrong? Should I fix this? Should I reach out? And instead of following it automatically, you pause long enough to ask, what specifically did I actually do that was wrong? And if the honest answer is nothing, you let that answer stand. That's the pivot, not a dramatic life decision, not a transformation that anyone else sees from the outside. Just a moment of recognition followed by a different choice. But here's what starts to happen when those moments accumulate. Your sense of responsibility gets cleaner, more accurate. You still take genuine ownership when it belongs to you. And I want to be clear that real accountability is not what we're trying to eliminate here. Real accountability is essential. What changes is the automatic, reflexive overassignment of fault, the guilt that shows up before evidence does. And when that pattern begins to shift, your relationships change, your decision-making changes, your risk tolerance changes, because you're no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's emotional state as if it were a reflection of your performance. You become more precise, more grounded, more genuinely present, because you're not spending so much internal bandwidth managing something that was never yours to manage. Fritz Perls, whose work is foundational to Gestalt therapy, had a phrase that captures something important here. Lose your mind and come to your senses. He wasn't being dismissive of thought. He was pointing towards this. Stop over-narrating your experience and start noticing what is actually here. what you are actually feeling, what the situation actually requires. Diffused guilt is the mind over narrating, telling a story about fault before the evidence has arrived. The pivot is coming back to what is actually true. What I want to leave you with today is this. Pivot points are not always built around major decisions. They are not always the moment you change careers, end a relationship, or make a declaration about who you're going to become. Sometimes the pivot point is a pause, a moment small enough that no one else in the room would notice it happening. That tightness in your chest after you said something true. That mental loop asking whether you did something wrong. That urge to reach out, smooth it over, take the responsibility back before anyone assigns it to you. Those moments are signals. And if you can learn to recognize them, not avoid them, not suppress them, not argue them away, but actually recognize them clearly enough to ask a better question, you can create something most people don't realize they've been missing. Choice. The choice to pause before acting. The choice to separate discomfort from wrongdoing. The choice to let someone else's reaction belong to them. The choice to stop abandoning your own clarity in order to manage the emotional temperature of everyone around you. That is not selfishness. It is not indifference. It is accuracy. And it is one of the most quietly powerful things a person can develop. I've watched it happen in a therapy room. I've watched students in school hallways begin to stand differently once they've stopped carrying responsibility for things they didn't cause. And I've had to practice it myself, because knowing this intellectually and living it are two different things. The pattern doesn't disappear overnight, but it begins to loosen the moment you can see it clearly enough to name it. So the next time that familiar feeling shows up, that pull, that tightness, that automatic assumption that something being wrong must mean you did something wrong. Pause. Ask one question. What is actually mine here? Not everything, not reflexively, actually. Because that question, that moment of genuine examination, is not just a therapy concept. It's a decision. And every time you make it, you move slightly closer to a version of yourself that is not driven by the fear of someone else's discomfort. That's the clarity. That's the freedom that begins in the smallest possible moment. And that recognition, that pause, that question, that honest answer, that is your pivot point. Thank you for joining me here on Pivot Point Strategy for Change. I'm Nik Michael. Until next time, keep moving forward, one insight, one direction, and one moment of awareness at a time. I leave you with one question. Think about it. What is your pivot point? What's your pivot point?